Hello, welcome back. The next chapter is about memory, but we have already been talking about memory. So we're going to continue in this vein. In the previous chapter, we talked primarily about working memory, but I had also previewed the history of the concept, taking it back to earlier ideas of short-term memory. And we're going to talk more about short-term memory in this chapter here, but also other forms of memory, including long-term memory, which is again something we kind of briefly discussed in the previous chapter. And I also believe that I might have said it made a passing reference to sensory memory in the preceding chapter. In fact, let's get into it because I did mention that when talking about the work of Atkinson and Shiffrin in the late 1960s. So I had mentioned that they were the ones who introduced the terminology of short-term memory, maybe not, completely not originally, but certainly the ones who made this term much more a part of the mainstream ideas regarding how memory works. And I had referred to the standard memory theory, and that's what we have right here, right? So down at the bottom, the idea is that we have all of the perceptual information coming in, that's labeled there as the stimulus. The idea is that it is briefly held in sensory memory, which is just this very, very brief, temporary, transient storage system that keeps this information just long enough for the attentional filters to go to work, right? So that's our next arrow here. The idea is that we're going to start filtering out extraneous information. The short-term memory system can't handle all of that data. So we're going to only let the task relevant, important things through. And then we are going to admit that into short-term memory, at which point we can keep it active, maintenance rehearsal. We talked about that business. Some way or another, information gets encoded into long-term memory, but of course, it can also be recalled from long-term memory, at which point it returns to short-term memory, where we keep it active again and think about it. So again, thinking of working memory in this way, that's the same thing. It's where we keep information active in our minds when we're thinking about it. So one of the things we're going to ask here is what justification can we say that these three memory systems are distinct stages of memory? That's something we need to worry about here. We also need to then understand, what are the properties of each of these systems? I just described sensory memory as being a high capacity but brief duration sensory system, memory system. How do we know that, right? So how can we justify that claim? What about short-term memory? What is its capacity? What is its duration? What about long-term memory? What is its capacity and what is its duration? We might also want to talk about the arrows, but some of those arrows have been covered in other chapters. When thinking about the stimulus coming in and perception, well, we have the chapter on that. We've already had a chapter on attention, and maybe even a couple of chapters that kind of dealt with attention, cognitive control, and so forth. So those arrows have been mostly covered here. Encoding and retrieval, that's something we're going to need to talk about. So that's going to be the goal of these notes here, is to talk about sensory memory research, short-term memory research, and long-term memory research, but also encoding and retrieval issues as well. So we're going to try to address all these things, but we're going to start with sensory memory here. So we're going to use the term buffer. This term came up when talking about Baddeley's working memory theory. And this, I just have a little note here that this term actually comes from computer science. So when you describe computer memory, especially what's called RAM, this is the kind of information that's kind of active while the computer is turned on, and it's held there temporarily. And then, of course, as you turn the computer off, it's just gone, right? And so calling it a sensory buffer kind of captures this idea that this kind of memory trace is very transient. And so that's how we're going to think of it here. So we're going to say here that there's, some kind of, activation of our sensory receptors, and this creates a brief lingering memory trace of that image, right? So just imagine you look at something and there's a lingering trace of that kind of visual image in your eyes or in your visual memory a little bit. And that's what it's called. Visual memory is also called iconic storage. But we would also have echoic storage to describe what happens auditorily. If you hear a sound, you can kind of still hear this faint echo of it for just a brief fraction of a second. And that's going to be another example of sensory memory here. And again, as I've described, the understood function of this system is hard to imagine a little bit because, if we try to introspect about our memories, we can easily kind of intuit the idea that we have short-term memory and we also have long-term memory, but it's hard to just introspect and intuit the existence of sensory memory. So this is one that required a little bit more careful consideration, especially when it comes to trying to study it. So as I have described then, the function is to just handle all of this massive influx of sensory data, hold on to it long enough to let those attentional filters go to work and determine which information to further admit into further processing. That description is what we have previously called early selection, right? We would also want to talk about late selection, but that's a whole other thing we've already covered. But the idea is that this is kind of where that early selection can work, right? So, as I have already described again, we're going to suggest here that this sensory buffer, sensory memory system has a large duration. We also want to assume that it has accurate data storage, right? So that's what veridical means. Veridical means truthful, right? And so what do we mean here? We certainly don't want to have any distortions, right? You might have heard of studies done in the past about how sometimes people's memories are unreliable and we recall things that never happened or we distort the events when we recall them. And that can certainly be true of long-term memory research. And, the research of Elizabeth Loftus, ever since the 1970s, has pioneered everything that we know about distorted and false memory phenomena. But we don't want that happening in sensory memory, right? Because if the incoming sensory data is somehow distorted, that would suggest then that everything that happens afterwards is also working on distorted data. And that would suggest we can't even perceive the outside world because the input gets inherently twisted the moment it comes into the mind. And we don't want that happening. So we're going to assume that there's veridical storage here. There's no false memories or distorted memories, right? We don't want to talk about hallucinations at this stage. So we're going to do that, but again, we're going to say large capacity, large enough to store all of this massive amount of data, but it has a very brief duration. It lasts only just a fraction of a second. And one reason we would expect this is that we are continuously receiving new information all the time, and that would then suggest that we need to keep everything moving, right? We don't want to hang on to stuff in sensory memory for too long. We need to get rid of it because more information is coming in just another second, right? So moment to moment to moment, second by second by second, more and more information is streaming into our sensory memory buffers. So we need to process that and dump it, right? So how do we know these things, right? That's what the real question is. How can we say for sure, the accuracy business, that's harder to measure. Um, the um, the size and duration. How do we really measure that? So this is where we can start with the visual version of things. And this is, again, as I had mentioned, called iconic memory, these lingering visual images. So I'm going to go through a demonstration. Now, there's a couple of limitations here. I can't really do a proper simulation of this experiment using PowerPoint, which I'm working with here. I also can't likely execute this through the video recording very well either. So we're going to have to use our imagination a little bit to kind of see how this would have played out in reality when this study was done. So what we're doing here is first called tachistoscopic presentation. That is, we are using a device called a tachistoscope, which we don't want to have to say too many times. So it's very often just preferred to just call it a T-scope instead, right? So we're going to use the T-scope because we can do this kind of stuff on computers now, but before we had computers for this kind of stimulus presentation, a T-scope is exactly what was useful for this. And all you want to think of it here is that it's simply a kind of a little box that has a way of presenting images inside of it, and you can regulate the exact timing of when an image gets presented to a person who's looking inside this box, perhaps. Um, and therefore you can control the duration of the stimulus presentation. And so when we talk about tachistoscopic presentation, we generally mean an image that's presented in just a very brief flash, right? Just it's presented in a brief fraction of a second. So I'm going to try to simulate that with what I just did. I'm going to try that again, right? So I don't know what you're seeing in the video stream here, but what I was doing is I had quickly hit the arrow button to show you this screen and then went back to the previous white screen. So you only see that for a fraction of a second. And the point here is that you got to remember everything that you saw in that fraction of a second, right? Right? Can you remember all 9 of those letters? So as I, whoops. So as I have described it here, we have a 3 by 3 array of letters, 9 letters. And what we call the whole report technique means to report the whole thing, right? Can you tell me all 9 of those letters? And this research was done by a guy named George Sperling in the early 1960s. And what he found right off the bat, as you could probably well imagine, is the answer is no. People cannot tell us the whole array of letters here, right? So let's go back. And so why are we doing this tachistoscopic rapid presentation? Hoping that you're going to see it. I'll go slower, right? The idea is that when you see it for that brief fraction of a second, you're not going to sit there and scan and read it, because that's when we start talking about processing the information and maybe taking it into short-term memory. What I want to do is I want to show it for this just fleeting fraction of a second, so that way it creates nothing but that lingering visual impression. And that's the iconic memory, right? The sensory memory. And that's what we want people to report, what's going on in that iconic memory buffer before it manages to keep on going into short-term memory, right? We want to restrict this information from going any further into those, thinking of those 3 boxes, right? Let me run back here, right? I don't want attention to start working here, because attention will allow the information to go to short-term memory. So I just want to restrict the information to the sensory memory box and not let it get any further to the right in our stages of processing. That's a big challenge, but that's the goal of using the tachistoscopic presentation. So as I had noted, Sperling, I said 63, I was wrong in 1960. So what Sperling found is that when asking people to perform the whole report, tell me all 9 letters, they cannot do this. Now, there's one possible interpretation of that finding, which is that maybe we're wrong about sensory memory having such a large capacity, because obviously if you could hold all of those letters, then you would have a large capacity, because you could keep all 9 of those letters in your sensory memory. And the fact that people can only report 3 or 4 of them instead could possibly suggest that it has a much smaller capacity than we had assumed. But this is where things have to sometimes get clever for cognitive research here. So Sperling says, I have an idea. What we're going to do is we're going to change the methodology to what is called the partial report technique, where we're going to use the exact same stimulus, right? We're going to have some 3 by 3 array of letters. But I'm only going to ask you to report one of those 3 rows, right? So it might be, let me run it back here. It might be the top row. So you'd say WXD. It might be the middle row. So you would say JMR, or it could be the bottom row, and your task is to say CPB, right? But here's the twist. I'm not going to tell you which row to report until after you have seen the letters, and then they're gone. So the way the flow of the experiment works is you have that tachistoscopic presentation of the letters for a brief second, fraction of a second, and then a tone appears. And if it's a high-pitched tone, that is your cue to report the top row. If it is a low-pitched tone, that is your cue to report the bottom row. Or if it's a middle-pitched tone, then you report the middle row. And so all you have to do now is discriminate which of those 3 tones it was, and then you report the appropriate row, top, middle, or bottom. And keep in mind again, this tone is not presented until after the letters have been presented and then removed. So what happens? Participants are actually quite successful here, right? When prompted to recall the top row, they can do it. When prompted to recall the bottom or middle row, they can also do that. So how do we interpret this? That they're successful in the partial report technique, but they're not successful in the whole report technique. One interpretation is that this system has a very large capacity, so it can keep all 9 of these letters active, but it has a very, very brief duration, and the duration is so brief that in the whole report technique, let's imagine this, let's come back to our letters. So you're a subject in the whole report version of the experiment, and you're asked to report all 9 of these letters. So what happens is that you start to say, okay, I can see in my visual memory the WXDJ. But then what happens? In the time it even takes you to get out those WXDJ, a couple of seconds has gone by and your memory trace has already faded. So it's not as if the MRCPB was never held in the memory trace. It's just that this all fades away so quickly that you don't really have time to report the whole thing before that memory trace just completely decays and fades away into nothingness. And the partial report technique shows that this is true, right? That people can report if they start with any of the other rows, right? So don't start with the top row as you be your natural tendency in the whole report technique. But if you start with the middle row or start with the bottom row, you're going to be able to report that. But obviously, you're not going to be able to say much about the other rows, right? Because again, the memory trace would fade away. So now, if this is true, one other thing that we might try to do is to estimate the time itself, right? How long does it take before that memory trace fades away? Can we estimate that? Well, here we have the result, about a third of a second, 300 milliseconds. How do we know that? Well, one variation that we can do in the partial report technique is to manipulate the timing between the point at which the letters disappear from the screen and the tone occurs, right? So if it's almost immediate, right? So there's essentially no delay or no lag. That's when you get the best performance. But what if we wait 100 milliseconds, right? So the letters disappear, and then we wait 100 milliseconds before a tenth of a second before we present the tone. Well, people are still doing okay on this task. What if we wait 200 milliseconds and then present the tone? Again, people are still doing okay on the task. But what happens if we wait 300 milliseconds? This is when people start to fail to perform even in the partial report version of the experiment. So that delay of 300 milliseconds turns out to be long enough to cause the memory trace to fade away, and therefore now their performance starts to drop pretty significantly back down to bad recall, right? Another way to do this is the backward masking technique. I had videos in previous experiments on the semantic priming tasks that demonstrated some backward masking here. I'm going to try to demonstrate how it would work in a sensory memory experiment. So what we're going to do here is that. So let's try that again. So let me run it back. So what's going to happen is you're going to see a different 3x3 array of letters. And then immediately after that array disappears, there's a little blue circle in one specific location, right? So that circle is appearing exactly where the letter P, the first letter in the array, would be, right? Now, if this was timed correctly, so clearly my button pressing in PowerPoint is not going to work to create an actual proper backward masking effect. But if this is timed properly, then you cannot see the letter P. It gets covered up. And so the argument here is that we are overwriting the memory trace in the sensory buffer here with that. So the P gets overwritten by that blue circle, but none of the other letters do, right? Because they're going to still be lingering there, right? So it's only the letter in that same space. This helps us understand a little bit about the veridical nature of sensory memory, because in that situation, the spatial arrangement of the letters is preserved and the mask only covers the thing in that same spatial position in the image. But a variation we can do is to delay the backward masker, right? How long can we, again, if we present the backward masking stimulus, that blue circle immediately with no delay after the letters are presented, you get the strong masking effect. What if I wait 100 milliseconds? Still a masking effect. What if I wait 200 milliseconds? Still, there's a masking effect. But what happens if I wait 300 milliseconds? Suddenly, the masking effect is gone. This would suggest then that the memory trace has already faded, so there's nothing there to mask, right? So in that situation, people will still be able to recall the letter at that point. So that's how we get through um, these conclusions that the sensory memory, at least in the case of this iconic memory experiment that Sperling has been doing, large capacity, brief duration, reasonably veridical, right? I already mentioned that the auditory version of this is called echoic memory. The idea is that it has similar properties. If we try to do certain partial report techniques, it's harder to do this research with auditory stimuli. But we suggest then that in variations that involve a partial report versus a whole report, we get similar findings, supporting the idea that this has large capacity and a brief duration. Been a minimal amount of research on tactile versions as well. There's not, as far as I know, an official name for tactile sensory memory other than tactile sensory memory. Um, so in that case, we would kind of expect similar findings, though. All right. Next up is short-term memory, but in the interest of keeping these videos at a manageable length, I'm going to cut it here. So we'll have this video just on sensory memory, and we will save short-term memory for the next one. And until then, that's it. Goodbye.